Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure today to introduce Giovanni Gomiero, who is a PhD student of the History Department at Ghent University. Giovanni studied history and historical sciences in Padua, where he started also studying Syriac and history of Christianity. He obtained his MA in 2021 with a thesis on the East Syrian historiography entitled Thomas of Marga and the Book of Superior, Historiography, Hagiography, and Historical Research in the East Monasticism of the 9th century. And this thesis was written under the supervision of Vito Roberti. His PhD builds upon and expands his previous studies on the Church of the East, and Giovanni's project is in fact focused on Thomas of Marga's Book of Superiors and aims at producing a comprehensive study of East Syrian monastic historiography and hagiography of the 6th to 10th century. Besides his focus on the Church of the East, Giovanni is also trained and worked in digital humanities. For instance, from January to July 2020, he worked as an inter-researcher at the IRHT in Paris within the digital cataloging project Ictobe. Then he also collaborated with the Grigori project focused on digital lemmatization and was a digital humanities fellows at the Beth Syriac Institute, with which he's still collaborating. Today, Giovanni will deliver a paper entitled While One Brother Was a Writer, the Other One Was a Bookbinder, Literary Activity and East Syrian Monks in Thomas of Marga's Work. Giovanni, the floor is all yours.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to the organizer and to Georgia for this kind of introduction. And we can start with the presentation now. It's okay, yes. We'll try. Great. So just give me an idea. If you see, okay, great. So today we will try to approach the problem of Thomas of Marga and the problem of the literary activity as represented in Thomas of Marga. I'm speaking about problems because it is a work in progress PhD I started just this year. And so I'm very happy that, for example, here is with us Marco Pavan, that is the monk that is making the critical edition of Thomas, and so he can help me and can help us in the discussion. And I want to point out to you that my problem today is to give you some ideas of what you can find in Thomas and and the way in which Thomas presents something interesting as the literary activity in the Syrian monasticism, and to receive from you comments, feedbacks, questions, and everything else. The presentation will be divided into three main parts. One, first, an introduction on Thomas and as an author, his works as texts, and the context in which Thomas was writing. Then we will go on to the core of the presentation. So this idea of studying, writing, and bookbinding. So these little familiar publishing houses that were present in some way and sometimes in the Lavra of Betawe. And then we will try to see how this theme can be located in the more broader context of the clash or supposed clash between knowledge and ignorance in the East Syrian Reform monasticism. Be aware when I speak about Lavra of Betawe, I'm using the terminology fixed by Chiala in his article of 2021, because Chiala demonstrated that Thomas is consistent in addressing the monastery of Betawe as a Lavra. So he made a distinction between Ombra, that is the Lavra, the Lavriotic system of the Reform monasticism, and Daira, that is the monastery not reformed. So I will always use the term Lavra for Betawe, and when I speak about Reform monasticism, I'm speaking about the reform by Abraham of Kashgar in the late 6th century that is well studied by Chiala and Julien in 2005 and 2008. So first, about Thomas, we need to, I put here a little sum up made by Toile in 2005, and we don't have any comprehensive bibliography on Thomas, any comprehensive work. We have some edition and translation. So we have the Badge one of 1893 and the Bejan on 1901. And then we have these two more recent, the Arabic translation made on the text edited by Bejan, by Albert Abuna in 1966, and the new appeared in June 2023, so literally 2 months before now, the Romanian translation made by Elena Dinu. And what we must remember is that the few biographical information we have about Thomas came to us by Thomas himself, and are fairly summarized by Fier in 1965 in his Notul, and by Toyle in his notice inside the Christian Arabic bibliography of 2009. Just some point that we must keep in mind when we are speaking about Thomas is that he is an eclectic intellectual monk. So it is not a normal monk in the sense that we can decide what is a normal monk in the East Syrian monasticism. We must remember that he's a bishop, is not only a Christian and a monk, but he's a bishop under the Abbasid rule of the mid-9th century. And this is very important in terms of try to contextualize the activity of Thomas. We know that the Church of the East lived different and several periods in the 9th century, but we know in particular that in the early 9th century, so under Timothy I, there was a strong connection and a strong also collaboration between the Caliph and the Patriarch. And then in the time of Thomas, so around 850, the Patriarch was imprisoned by the Caliph. So you can understand how much these two contexts of the first quarter of the 9th century and the second quarter of the 9th century are very different. And the activity of Thomas and the life of Thomas is divided between the first period and the second period. So we need to understand that to see how Thomas was working, in which context was working, and so to understand better his works. And then we must keep in mind, and this is really important, that the Book of Superiors is a peculiar text with a precise agenda. It's not a collection of hagiographies in chronological order. It's not an Historia Monastica. It's not an historiographical work. It's a mixture of the three, probably. And this is also has been also said by Muriel Lebier and Mariana Mazzola. But what it is clear is that Thomas is doing something precise. So he's giving us an image of the monasticism, of the East Syrian monasticism, and of the Church of the East as a whole. And he decided what to put inside, what to exclude. He sometimes declared that, saying sentences like, here I am omitting something, be aware I'm omitting something because also some other writers omitted something. So there is always this idea in which it's clear that Thomas is aware of his role and aware of his activity. So we cannot use this text as a source for interesting information because it is not a source, a neutral source, is a precisely placed text inside the idea of Thomas and the representation of the Church of the East and of the East Syrian monasticism that Thomas wants to give to the reader. Regarding some more information about his life and his works, the only date we know is 832, that is his entrance in the Lavra of Betawe. This date is fixed by Thomas himself in the Book of Superiors. But we know that the sixth book, which the correct title is History of Cyprian and Gabriel, was written before the entrance in the Lavra. And so we must imagine a young writer before becoming a monk, probably during his scholastic formation, because from internal reference it's pretty clear that Thomas had a strong monastic scholastic formation. And so we need to remember that this sixth book was added in an editorial level after, is in every manuscript is presented as a sixth book. So I'm not saying it has been added some years before now. It has been added probably before the 15th century, but still it is not the sixth book of the Book of Superiors. It's simply a work written by Thomas. It is a very complicated work in terms of structure, in terms of content, but it is clear that it's something different, produced in a producing a different phase of writing of Thomas. And then we don't have information about the period 832-850, and I'm fixing here the date 850 because it's the death of Abraham II, the patriarch of the Church of the East. We know that Abraham II was that one who named Thomas Bishop of Marga. So for sure, Thomas was a monk between 837 and at least 850. And then after 850, Thomas is for sure a bishop. And in this phase, he probably composed some materials that then became part of the book 4 and 5 during his formation as a monk, because the book 4 and 5 seems a collection of lives of recent. When I say recent, I speak recent in the compared to Thomas, so late 8th, early 9th century. So it is this collection of lives of saints flourished in the Lavra of Betawe, and these two books seem different from the other. We cannot say absolutely that they were written before. I'm saying that some materials of these books probably were written before and then rearranged after in the composition phase of the Book of Superiors as Book 4 and Book 5. And then we must remember that the entire Book of Superiors was probably written after 850, since all the references to Abraham II are addressed in the past, like the Abraham II is probably yet already dead. And so we have this composition phase of the Book of Superiors that is after 850. Then a little notice about the problem of identification between Thomas of Marga and Thomas of Bedgarmai. You know, there is this argumentation of Assemani that say that these two are the same person, and Fie saying no, they are not the same person. Still, the argumentation of Fie is a little bit more convincing than the one of Assemani, but still is not convincing in its entirety. So since we will not find more information and more data on this, we cannot decide precisely. There will be a possibility with the treatise of Nonnus of Nisibis on Thomas of Bedgarmai against Thomas of Bedgarmai that Joachim Jacob is now editing and translating, and we will wait for that treatise to see if there is some more information about Thomas of Bedgarmai that can help us in comparing the two. Now, if everything is clear, we can move on to the core of the presentation. So these little familiar publishing houses. Thomas presented this type of activity in three couple. Two are clearly connected between themselves, and the third one is a little bit distincted. The first one that I want to present you is that one of Acha and Shubhal Maran. We are in book 2, chapter 34. And here we can see the presentation of the two is while Rabban Maracha was a writer, his brother was a bookbinder. Then we go on with a little summarized version that is the two brothers grown only with their mother, were before trained in the schools of the village of Shalmat, and then, and I'm quoting, when they reached the age of full youthfulness, they went out of the schools and made themselves disciples in this Lavra. So you see there are not a lot of details, but still we have two brothers, one writer and one bookbinder. They were trained in the school, and then with their mother, they went together to the Lavra, and they lived in the Lavra of Betawe, in their cell, close one to the other, with also the mother in a cell close to them. So there is this little family that moved from a scholastic environment inside the monastery and start acting as a little publishing houses. They were probably working for the monastery. We don't have a lot of information about that. And then Acha made his great career, and he died probably around 754. So in terms of chronology, this couple must be placed in the early 8th century. So this is the first model of literary activity of this type inside the Lavra of Betawe, proposed by Thomas. We can move to the second model, and here you can see we are in book 5, chapter 6. And so try to remember that the book 5 and the book 4 were probably composed in some materials before the book 2. Because here you see a complete different model, but we are late in the story. We are around the early 9th century. We are under Timothy I with this episode of Yabala and Kardag. So the old Kardag was younger than his brother, and he was an elegant writer, and Yabala was a bookbinder, as the blessed Maraja, his brother. So here it is clear that Thomas is making a clear comparison between the two couples. Kardag and Yabala in the book 5 are the same type of brother as Maraja. But still, this is not completely true if we look more in depth inside the text, because the two brothers were from the region of Marga, but were fully trained inside the Lavra. So they entered as soon as possible in the Lavra of Betawe, and they were trained only as monks. They will proceed in their career, becoming the Bishop of Gilan and Dylan. So there are two missionary bishops inside the East Syrian church. And so what is interesting here is that the Yabala and Kardag are presented as perfect ascetics, as perfect monk, perfect in prayer, perfect in their practice, famous for their conduct of life, not for their activity as a writer. And more, remember this distinction. Achen Shubal Maran trained in the schools and then moved to the monastery. Yabala and Kardag trained entirely in the monastery. So they are not connotated as writer, but they are connected as this type of couple, writer, bookbinder, by Thomas himself with Acha and Shubal. Then we can move to the third couple. Yes, that is more famous because here we have the famous Ananisho, that is the supposed author of the Book of Paradise. And we have the beautiful new book of David Michelson about the Library of Paradise. So this way of rearranging knowledge and these libraries inside the East Syrian Reform monasteries. And here we can see a more longer extract of Thomas. I can read this blessed man, Ananisho and Ishoyab, his brother, came from the county of Adiabene. They were both trained in doctrine in the city of Nisibis, disciples of the blessed Ishoyab. This second Ishoyab is the Ishoyab that became Ishoyab III, so the patriarch. Then they became, they are Ananisho and Ishoyab, his brother, not Ishoyab the patriarch. They became disciples in the great Lavra, as testified by their books in the library of this Lavra, that demonstrate that they were written there by their own hands. So Thomas is saying that the witness of their activity in the Lavra of in the great Lavra of Mount Isla was that in the library of the Lavra of Betawe there were some books written in the monastery of Isla by Ananisho and Ishoyab that they brought together with them when they moved to the Lavra of Betawe. Because when they came to this Lavra, so in the Lavra of Betawe, they dwell in silence according to the rule of ascetics. And Rabbi Ananisho, the wise of intellect, labored so hard in the meditation of the books, or scriptures in this case, that surpassed all who were before and after him in his knowledge. So Thomas is saying that Ananisho is the most important writer and intellectual monk of the history of Betawe. And he is explaining this little couple, this other couple of brothers. Here we are in the first half of the 7th century. So remember, we are Aachen Shubal were in the first half of the 8th century. Here we are in the first half of the 7th century, so 1 century before. And Yabala and Kardag are in the early 9th century. So Ananisho started working as a professional writer when he arrived to the Lavra of Betawe. And he worked at the request of the Bishop of Shenna, that was his brother Ishoyab, that made the ecclesiastical career. And then for the Metropolitan of Arbela, that was his previous teacher, Ishoyab III. And then he worked also at the request of the Patriarch, Georgis I. So we have a professional writer requested by the ecclesiastical hierarchy. In a sense, this ecclesiastical hierarchy is not really external from this monastery, because both the Bishop of Shenna, the Metropolitan of Arbela, and the Patriarch, in this case, are a previous monk of the Lavra of Betawe, so they were colleagues of Ananisho. But then we have a third type of formation, a third model. The schools in Nisibis, not more the schools in the little village of Shalmat, then a first monastic formation in the great Lavra of Isla, and then a second monastic formation in the Lavra of Betawe. And at the end, the literary activity. So we can see that, in a sense, the model proposed by Thomas are two. One, this of Ananisho and the one of Acha, and Shubal-Maran, in which there is the scholastic formation and then the activity in the monastery. And so there is a presentation of a monk as an intellectual, a complete intellectual, trained for that and trained for work in this field. And then the second model, that one of Yabalai Kardaki, in which the presentation of the two brothers as writer and bookbinder is not affecting in any case the presentation of the two monks, because Yabalai and Kardaki, remember, are more ascetics, are more great in prayer than in their literary activity. Thomas didn't say anything about their activity as literate monks, but he said a lot about their practices, their ability, their skills, and they were chosen by Timothy I to be bishops precisely for that feature. So Thomas is presenting two distinct models, and it will be interesting to see with you also in the discussion what do you think about which is the final model proposed by Thomas. So if Thomas wants to propose one or the other, which will be that one more conforming to the other representation that he gave in his work in the Book of Superiors. We can move now from the particular to the general to see why this supposed clash between an entirely monastic formation, that one of Yabalai and Kardaki, and a scholastic and intellectual information, that one of Enanisho and Acha, can be seen from a more comprehensive point of view, from a broader landscape. So the problem of a clash between knowledge and ignorance in East Syrian monasticism. And first, you can see here a little piece of Isaac of Nineveh, which is saying that the teaching through ink has been added after the transgression. I think that this quotation is really important, because it is Isaac is not saying be aware the books are a problem. There is a problem in knowledge. There is a problem in study. He's not saying that. He's simply saying that the ink, so the manuscript, the books, and so all the literature written, in a sense, is something related to our sinful nature. It's not something related to God. So it's after the transgression. And this type of idea, that is not saying literature is bad and ignorance is good. It's not this type of dichotomy. Is a more softened way to see where is the priority. So the priority cannot be inside the book. The priority must be inside the prayer and inside their connection with God. And this type of discourses were bringing on by John of Daliata and Joseph Azaya after Isaac. But then we can see two apophthegmata that were probably in the hands of Thomas, since they were in the Paradise of the Father. They are transmitted also in the Paradise of the Father. Here I gave the references with the Paradise of the Father and the Greek's collection. And we cannot delve inside the problem of the apophthegmata here, and in particular the problem of the apophthegmata in Syriac, but if you have any question about that, it will be great to discuss with you. And so here the first apophthegma is Abba Theodore of Permer asked Macarius, I have 3 books and I gain profit from them, and the brethren allow me, borrow them from me, and they also have profit. So these books are helping us in our monastic life. What to do now? And Macarius said, ascetic labors are beautiful, so it is great that you use the books for ascetic labors, but still the greatest is voluntary poverty or renunciation, depends from the translation you want. So the Mesarkuta, so the real value is the Mesarkuta, not to read. And so Theodore go and abandon this book and give the books to and give the money that he received to the poor. And then the second and the last example is this more complicated apophthegma, complicated in terms of tradition, as you can see, is pretty well spread inside the East Syrian tradition. And the apophthegma is Ammon is speaking to Poimen, and Ammon said, if I have the necessity to talk with a neighbor, do you want me to speak with the words of the scriptures or with the saying of the elders? And Poimen answered, if you cannot keep silent, and this is very important because the first step is it is better to not speak with another one. It is better to stay in your cell and to pray. But if you cannot keep silent, it is better to speak with the sayings of the elders rather than with the scripture, because there is a danger in a man that speaks with the scriptures. So there is this idea of if you cannot keep silent, please use the sayings of the elders that are something more easy and that not request a lot of efforts to understand and to explain, and not the scriptures that request a study, request attention, request care, and a monk must not be focused on this. So I think that these last examples helps us because it brings us to the problem of the 3 or 2 representation given by Thomas. So in the East Syrian monasticism, as represented by Thomas, it seems always that there is this dichotomy, this a possible clash that is never a clear clash, but is always there, ready to become. And between ignorance and study, between simple knowledge and erudition, between the natural knowledge of a monk inspired by God and the scholastic knowledge built. And this is also can also be seen through the several examples of the clashes between scholastic institution and monastic institution, as explained by Bettiolo and Berti in their works. But still, it remains open the problem of which is the model proposed by Thomas, and which is at the end the solution, if there is a solution, for this paradoxical representation inside the Church of the East. There's always this dichotomy made by, remember, intellectual monk, literate monk as Thomas, that presented the literary activity and the intellectual activity as something complicated, because it is better to pray, it is better to dedicate your own life to God and to the meditation. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will be glad to hear your question, answer, and everything else.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I'm sure people will be joining in with questions. The floor is open for any sort of intervention, comment, suggestion, or question. I'll start with one. I suppose the most obvious thing is whether this is a true dichotomy. I mean, it's obviously a topos. Whenever you look through this literature, they always will say, go more simple, go with less things, go less intelligent. If this counteracts in any way the activity that has happened and has been happening of copying books, do you think it was a hindrance, or they just went in parallel? How do you see that?
No, I think that it is for sure something absolutely topical in this type of literature. What is interesting is that Thomas is not presenting intellectual monks as an Anisha and Daha as something wrong. And he's presenting also the skills in terms of asceticism and of prayer of an Anisha and Daha. So it seems that Thomas is never saying that this formation will bring you a less ascetic monk. He's not saying that. He's saying that the skills for prayer, the skills to be a real monk close in his cell of an Anisha are not less than one of Jabal and Kardag. So this is interesting, I think, because if at the end Thomas will present, okay, but the best one, the best model is only that one of only prayer in your cell without books, we can say, okay, this is a topos for to say, yeah, the monk at the end is someone who pray. But Thomas is not saying that, because he's not saying that Jabal and Kardag are better than in Anisho and Ishoyab or Racha and Shoel. He's simply presenting different possibilities. And this is interesting because there is the topos, but there is also probably something else, probably also related to the figure of Thomas himself, because Thomas himself was a literate monk. So in a sense, he can present Jabal and Kardag as the model, fully trained in the monastery, but still he was not trained in the monastery. So there is also this problem of representation between the author and the text that is very interesting and that emerged at different times in Thomas with different examples. So this one on the literary activity is one, but there are others inside the Book of Superiors that permits us to see this problem of double, triple representations that seems all to have the possibility to stay all together, in a sense, inside the text. This is not problematic, but still can be interesting for us to understand this type of representation.
Very good, thank you. We have a couple of three questions. Hands raised up. CR van den Elzen, please.
Yes, thank you. This was a very illuminating presentation for me. As to whether there is a dichotomy, in a way, but I'm not quite sure about Thomas of Marga, but perhaps other authors, he is presenting perhaps book learning as a means of asceticism. So it is through learning that that some monks can perfect their ascetic abilities. So in that way, you fit book learning into a model of various ascetic means, and that some monks can choose through book learning to perfect their ascetic abilities. And in that way, you kind of negate the dichotomy by making one the means and asceticism the end of the pursuit. Would you perhaps agree with that way of description, or at least the way I see that?
No, I agree. I'm speaking about dichotomy simply because, for example, the entire fifth book is built up by hagiographies of different monks. And the presentation is about, we have 6 hagiographies, more or less. And the only one that represent an intellectual monk, a literate monk, that is the first one of Shubhalisho, is the only monk and the only bishop that made a failure. So the problem is that the last book is built with only representation of great ascetic, with any type of knowledge, with any type of study. So the example of this is Marelaya of Mukan, that lasts for 5 chapters, and Marelaya is presented precisely as the monk that is only able to read the gospel, nothing more. He can only chant the psalms, he can only read the gospel and nothing more. And Elia, Narses, Yabalan Kardag, and Joseph, that are the other character of the book 5, are all presented in this way as the last model, and they are only idiot, in a sense, eduto, simple monks. And instead, Shubhalisho, the only literate one, is the only one that failed his mission. So it seems a dichotomy in Thomas, because at the end of the Book of Superiors, he built an entire group of models, the ending one, the final models, that are only of the second type, of the type of perfect ascetic. I'm not saying it is a clear dichotomy, because it can be a clear dichotomy if Thomas will end the paragraph on Enanitia, not Aha, saying, be aware, this type of literate monk is a wrong one. He's not saying that. He's saying this type of literate monk is a great one. They build great works for us, they prayed a lot, they were great ascetics. So Enanitia is presented as one of the most important characters in the entire history, not only of the Tower, but of the Church of the East. So I'm not saying Thomas is a dichotomy only in this sense. So he is a dichotomy inside the structure of the Book of Superiors, not in terms of content, because in terms of content, it works. So as you were saying, he is presenting 2 types. So it is possible for one monk to go to perfect asceticism with the study of book, absolutely, because Enanitia was doing that. So, but there is still this structural problem inside the work that requests more study, simply, probably.
Thank you, Matteo.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, for your presentation. Little by little, I understand more the very complicated work of Thomas. I think that one problem is that, as you said many times, it is that Thomas was educated. Mm-hmm. But I think that one question is what education he had, or he chose to have, because for example, Bettiolo said already years ago that Thomas doesn't cite Isaac of Nineveh or others of that we can say group. But as we discussed many times, Thomas doesn't cite Evagrius in only, and there is only one exception in Elias, and you're studying it. But so why this silence? And also, I am curious because you said that the gospel is too complicated. What is the role of Theodore of Mopsuestia in Thomas of Marga? Because this is an interesting. So, which education had or choose to propose to the monks Thomas? Because there is a problem. Because Thomas can be, I think, can we connect Thomas of Marga in the 9th century with Shubhal Maran, which is in early 7th century, a companion of Babai the Great, which does not have an Evagrian ascetic line, but he has his own ascetic line, which it is maybe outside the great reform of Abraham of Kashgar. So can we trace a line with these few scarces clues, or it is only in my mind a devil project? I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Matteo, for the question. Starting from the end, I don't think it will be possible to trace a line between Shubal Maran and Thomas, simply because Shubal Maran was part of a monasticism in which the reform of Abraham was arrived in that moment, and Thomas of Marga is entirely part of the East Syrian reform monasticism. So it don't seem that Thomas came as scenes with Shubal Maran, as you were saying, something different from the East Syrian reform monasticism. For Shubal Maran, this is great. For Thomas, I think Thomas is a perfect reform monk of the 9th century. In terms of formation, it's complicated. We have some hints by the study of Berti and Bettiolo, but still, for as long as my research is going on, I can say you that he quoted Theodore of Mopsuestia, and I identified some quotation. But if we think that Thomas probably had a scholastic formation in the Reformed school of Adiabene, the Reformed school, I mean the Reformation of Babai the musician, that was made at the beginning of the 8th century. We don't know anything about the way of teaching inside the school, by the way. But still, we can think that in that school where they were trained in exegesis and in scriptures. So I think that the formation and the quotation by Theodore can come from this environment. The only other sure lecture of Thomas was the Paradise of the Father. And this is perfect for an East Syrian reform monastic monk. I think he is not quoting Evagrius a lot, simply because he's not reading Evagrius at all. Right? I think that Thomas was using or the Book of the Paradise or other handbooks for East Syrian reform monasticism, full of quotation of Evagrius, Marcus, Isaiah of Scetis. So this type of selection of saying from Evagrius, because the use that Thomas made of Evagrius didn't allow us, I think, to say that Thomas ever opened a book of Evagrius in his life. I think that Thomas knew Evagrius and used it because he was an East Syrian Reformed monk, but for sure, Thomas has not the awareness of Evagrius of Babai. So the Evagrian characterization of the East Syrian Reformed monasticism in the early 7th is completely different from that one of Thomas. For Thomas, is more important and more clear as a model, also in terms of literary structure, the Paradise of the Fathers, in which Evagrius is quoted, and so you can, I find some quotation of Evagrius in Thomas that came from the Book of Paradise, and for example, one of these came from the epitome of the Dicho Catraia. So is a quotation of Evagrius in the Dicho that entered inside the Paradise and was quoted as Evagrius by Thomas. So I mean, there's always this second level that is the Paradise of the Father in terms of ascetical literature. But still, it is difficult to say how Thomas was trained. What it is clear is that he spent some years probably as a secretary in Baghdad, secretary of the patriarch. So probably there was trained as a copyist, as a secretary. He had access probably to sources, to text, to libraries in Baghdad, we can think, but still we don't have any information. The only sure thing is that Thomas was using a Paradise of the Father or more than one Paradise of the Father, depends from what we can say now about the problem situation of the Paradise of the Father. That is not the theme of today, but still there is this big problem. I think that since we will not find documentation or information about the schools of Babé the musician, because the only information we have came from Thomas and are only in terms of structural positioning of the reform of Babé the musician, we cannot say nothing more. Probably in Theodore Barconi can be seen something similar, because Theodore Barconi was teaching as a professor, but more in the area of southern Iraq probably, and 50 years before Thomas. So Theodore Barconi can be a comparison, I think. I'm pretty sure of this, but we will see. For now, we cannot say nothing more, I think, but probably Marco can add something on this, because, but I don't know.
Thank you. Marco?
Yes, thank you, Giovanni, for your presentation. Unfortunately, I had nothing more to say about this topic, because as far as my research, my critical edition is going on, I just noted a possible quotation of the authors that maybe were included in some edition of the Fathers, but you know, this is a topic that needs more research, I think. Yeah. For now, I have just a couple of questions that we already discussed together, and I would like to bring into this public discussion. So the first one, you, and I agree on that, you noticed that the sixth book of the Historia Monastica is, in fact, another work, probably a work from made by the young Thomas, okay? But since there is some overlap between the book 6 and the first 5 books, okay, do you think that the vision of monastic life, because I think this is the issue of your topic, okay, the general vision of monastic life, what is a monk, okay? Do you think that the vision of Thomas about monastic life some way shift or change from his early youth to his old age, okay? Because I think that there are different views, okay? The book 6 seems to have a quite peculiar way of seeing the monastic life, while in the 5 books, in the Historia Monastica properly, the vision is more nuanced, is more complicated, okay? There are many streams probably, okay? This is the first question. The second one is about an issue, okay, a topic we discussed just 1 week ago or some. So, in my opinion, an issue is not presented as a model of monastic life, okay? The presentation of Thomas is in many ways puzzling, because an issue is deemed to be the author of the Paradise, the only Paradise as one author. And it seems to be taken for granted that all the East Syrian church knew one edition of the Paradise with one author. And this is not the case, okay? Manuscripts, are giving us different data. So it seems that Thomas, the intention of the narrative of Thomas is to present Ananisha as the author of the Paradise, okay? He studied at the school of Nizami, he went to Egypt, he knew the famous ascetics of Egypt, then he went back to Iraq, and then he entered a monastery where he get out because of struggles that were going on in this monastery and so on. It's a the presentation of Ananisha, even as a writer, is very, you know, I would say complicated, okay? So do you agree with me that Ananisha is not presented as much as a literate monk or educated monk, but he, especially as the author of the Paradise, that the main concern, interest of Thomas was to give an author to the paradise an author that was somewhat trained or that lived in his monastery in Batavia. What do you think about that?
Okay, no, thank you very much, Marco. No, I completely agree on this last point on an issue, because as we discussed it before, and I owe a lot of this reflection to Adrian Pirta, there is this clear way of Thomas of putting the flag of the love of Betawe on the composition of the paradise, I think. So I'm not saying that Inanisio didn't compose a paradise. He probably composed the paradise of Betawe, so the version of the Betawe monastery, because the way in which Thomas is describing the paradise is clear that he's looking at a manuscript with an index, because he's giving the numbers of the division of the paradise. But still, Thomas is trying to bring the production of the paradise to the love of Betawe as the only place in the East Syrian church that produced it. And we know, as you were saying, that is not the case. And this is also probably the reason because we lost entirely from the manuscript tradition, and is also a study made by Pirta. We lost the name Inanisio. In any single manuscript, you can see Inanisio as the name of the author of the paradise. This is not because Thomas invented something. It's probably because we lost simply the tradition of Betawe, in which probably there was written Inanisio. We don't know. But still, yes, Inanisio is presented with this idea, and more we can add that Inanisio is also in the representation of Thomas is the author of the Hudra, the new reform of the liturgical years that was made by Ishoyab III, and this is attested in the manuscript tradition. But Ishoyab III asked Inanisio to build it. So in a sense, Thomas is saying that the most important monastic handbook, the Paradise of the Father, and the most important liturgical reform of the entire history of the Church of the East were made by a single monk of Betawe. So it is clear this idea of representing Betawe as the core of the entire history of the Church of the East. So I absolutely agree in that, and we need to research more on this field to understand more. Regarding the sixth book, yes, I think it will be possible to see different representation of the monk and of the perfect ascetic, because, for example, in the book 6, that is divided between the history of Cyprian in the early 7th century, and then the history of Gabriel and his brother Paul, also in the late 8th century. You see a representation that is strange, because it is before the life of Cyprian, and then the life of Gabriel and Paul, and then a long list divided into chapters of miracles, in particular healing, exorcism, something that is completely disappeared from the paradise, from the Book of Superiors. So it seems that Thomas in the book 6 was making a different work. Probably we can say that the book 6 is a Historia Monastica of the monastery of Cyprian, in a sense, because it is focused on the monastery of Cyprian, but more is focused on two figures of the monastery of Cyprian. So in a sense, is a collection of two hagiographies, one of Cyprian, one of Gabriel, but were made only for praise this great monk, praise these great saints, and let them be commemorated, I think. In the other sense, as you know, and everyone that read the Book of Superiors can understand, the Book of Superiors has different structure, has a different goal, is more an historiographical work in this sense. So it tried to present the entire history of the church and the monastery inside the history of the church. So it is possible with further research to see that in the sixth book, there is also a different model of representing the monk. What I can say for now is that in the sixth book, it is clear a different model of representing some fact. Because, for example, there is one episode that is presented also in the Book of the Superiors and also in the sixth book, in the history of Cyprian, and the judgment that Thomas made on the true character, that is Amran Bar Muhammad, is a problematic figure. The presentation that he gave in the book, in the history of Cyprian and Gabriel, the book 6, is very different from the one that he gave in the book 4 of the Book of Superiors. in a sense that in the book 6 is saying, oh, he was a very evil guy, he was destroying all the monasteries, he was destroying the region. And in the book 4, he said, yes, he made some mistake, but we were friends with him. So, of the same person regarding the same episode. So it is clear that Thomas, between the book 6 and the Book of Superiors, changed a lot and decided to present things in different way, to judge episodes in different way, and to arrange the history not more as two hagiographies altogether, but as an entire painting on the Church of the East and the East Syrian monasticism. So I'm sure that this hypothesis you made is absolutely true, but we need to see it in the text. But still, I'm sure that can be seen also this different way of representation of monasticism in the sixth book.
Thank you. I believe Andy has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Giovanni. It's a fascinating material. My question relates to the other half of what we've now been talking about, which is you've mentioned the several cases where one of the brothers is identified as the bookbinder, and I'm wondering whether there's any reflection in Thomas of Marga about the physical production of these manuscripts. I mean, as a bookbinder, in terms of relating to education, when does someone learn to do this? In what context? I assume it's someone else teaching them, but is there any reflection on that? You mentioned, and also connected to that, sort of the economic situation relating to the monastery, because of course that's also not cheap, and you need to have the funds to produce this. So, and you mentioned the one case where there's this reflection on this owning this manuscript, and then the discussion where the manuscript is given away because it's obviously too expensive to keep. So is there any other reflection on this side of the equation?
Yes, there are a lot. It is confusing the material, but there are a lot. First, there are no information about bookbinding as an activity and as a formation. What is clear is that, for example, Aka and Shubal Maran and Inanisha and Shoyab were trained to do that in the schools, and then they entered in the monastery. So they were not trained in the monastery to be binders. So it is possible to think that in the schools there were courses, I don't know, there were laboratories to learn how to bind a manuscript. And but we don't know. And in a sense, these little sentences, one brother was a writer, the other was a bookbinder, seems a very topic one with not further investigation, because as Pier Giorgio Borbone pointed out, and I'm really grateful to him, in Barebreus there is one little piece in which Barebreus is saying, oh yes, in that monastery in the 8th century there was this brother that was a writer, and the other one was a book painter. So one was writing, the other was painting. And also Barebreus didn't give any more reference. So it seems a topical representation of a couple of brothers that went together in the monastery and worked together for the monastery. So we don't have any information about that. We have information about books and finances of the monastery, yes. There is the beautiful thesis of Cinzia Villagomez on the finances and economics in the East Syrian Reform monasticism. And in the case of Thomas, what is interesting is that there is, for example, a case in which a patriarch arrived to the monastery of Betawe to steal a gospel, a golden gospel, very well decorated, and then the monk acted against the patriarch to maintain the gospel inside the monastery. So there is this idea of books as precious things inside the monastery. And we have also some example of finances in which the monastery was not so well founded, and so it was the monastery was searching for patrons, for help by the nobility, by other churches. I mean, other churches in the area, and for example, it is interesting that all these problems, financial problem of the Lover of Betawe, happened in the late 8th century, so after the Abbasid Revolution. And what is more interesting in this sense is the representation of the Arabs and of the Muslims that Thomas gave in the Book of Superiors. Because if you read the Book of Superiors without knowing the history of the Arabic conquest, you will feel that the Arabs arrived in Iraq in the late 8th century. and started to rule Iraq in the early 9th century. And this is a clear representation given by Thomas. And also when he gave some hints that permit the reader to understand that, yes, there are the Arabs now, it is always a representation that is built to say, yes, there are the Arabs, but still we are controlling the land. Still we are the Church of the East. This representation written while the patriarch is imprisoned is puzzling, because the patriarch is in prison and you are presenting your history and your church as the triumphant church that won on everything and controlled the landscape. And in some cases, like in book 3, there is this case of Maran that was sent to be the metropolitan of the Salak region, that is the mountain region above Erbil, so close to Erbil. That was an Arabic city from the mid 7th century. So there were the Arabs in Erbil from 1 century. And then Maran arrived in these mountains above, and there were the Persian reigning there, some Persian landlords. And the inhabitants, the Christian inhabitants, asked Maran to save them from the Persian landlords that were taxing them. And Maran said, oh, no problem. In a while, they will arrive the Arabs and will save us. So there is this idea of the Arabs that will arrive in the late 8th century to free the Christian from the Persian landlords. But this representation, and I am stressing a lot to this problem, it is a problem, is given to the fact that Thomas is building a precise history with a precise goal. He's not saying us how the thing went in the past, how the history developed, but he's saying us what we must to think about the history of the Church of the East. And unfortunately, a lot of time we believe Thomas too much, and we believe that everything went as he discussed it. And so if we want to believe that, we must believe that the Arab conquest happened in the late 8th century. And so, as you can see, there are all these problems mixed together. In terms of books, we have hints, little hints. For example, Lenanisho was not only producing book, but was writing epigraphs in his entire cell. So he was writing in the wall all the works. So, for example, his brother arrived to his cell one day and see Lenanisho writing on the wall everything, definitions about philosophy. And so Ishoyab asked him, okay, please write also a book, not only engrave in the stone your knowledge. So there's always this idea of books as for sure important, but still not a lot of detail. This is something really strange, because Thomas gives us a lot of information in terms of literature, in terms of books, in terms of activity of schools, but it's always superficial information in a sense. Probably because was not the goal of the Book of Superiors. Because probably for the ideology that Thomas was representing was not useful to stay too much on the problem of bookbinding. This is the only answer I give me for now, because otherwise it is always puzzling, this amount of detail, but every detail is not very well described. So in a sense, you see a lot of interesting stuff, but it's difficult to place this stuff all together, and more to place them in a more broader landscape. This is the real problem with Thomas. The difficulty is to see how all the information he gave us can be put together with the other information of the other works all around his context and his previous tradition of the East Syrian historiography and the geography. We have a lot of text, we have a lot of possibility to compare, but still the representation of Thomas is really peculiar in this sense, and so request more work, nothing more.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Unless a very quick question jumps in strongly at this time, I would like to thank our speaker today for his paper and conversation, and everyone who joined in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. See you next time.